So when the user is booking a flight and he says, hey, I want to have 5 seats, then we should take that number, 5, and decrease the remaining number of seats in the flight. So now go ahead into your flight controller, scroll a little bit down until you can find where we are adding bookings. So here in book, we go to the flight, and to the bookings, we add a new booking. And afterwards, after we have added a new booking, we should go ahead, take the flight again, and decrease remaining number of seats minus equals or decrement by DTO dot number of seats, right? So if I book 5 seats, the flight should have 5 seats less to offer. Now you can see that this isn't working, and it's not working because remaining number of seats is immutable. Well, you can click on that and press F12 to directly navigate to it. You can see we're using a record. So the properties inside here are not changeable after they got initialized. So remaining number of seats is immutable. That's the difference between a record and a class in C#. Now, if we want to go ahead and change that property here after initialization, we can simply make it mutable by creating public int, exactly the same name, remaining number of seats, make it a property, set get, and set it to remaining number of seats. So now we have a property, the value is directly correlated to remaining number of seats right here, the property, right? And I'm missing a semicolon right here. And it's a property which you can get and even set. So now once we save it and we come back here, we can see the red underline is gone because remaining number of seats is now switched from being immutable to being mutable. Now, for this domain validation rule, where we should not be able to overbook a flight, which we haven't solved yet, right? So let's say remaining number of seats is 2 or 5, and I'm having here DTO booking number of seats like 20, it would still work. So we could go into the negative range. So we definitely need to take care about that. But first of all, let me explain which error code or HTTP status that is. It's 409, which is conflict. Conflict indicates that a request could not be completed due to a conflict with the current state of the target resource. So we have a conflict here. We only have 5 numbers of seats left, and you want to decrease it by 20, which would go into a negative range, but a flight cannot have minus 15 remaining number of seats, right? That doesn't make sense. So we should now handle that scenario. Let's simply avoid overbooking right before we add the booking to the flight. So once we checked, hey, do we have a flight with that unique ID? And we don't have it, we return. And once we have it, we can also check if the flight dot remaining number of seats is smaller than DTO number of seats. So how many do you want to book, right? We can simply go ahead and return a conflict, which is status code 409, just as I said. We create a new object and say the message, since this should really be something unique for each scenario. The number of requested seats exceeds the number of remaining seats. So you try to book more seats than the flight has available, right? So those are the remaining number of seats. So let's say we have 5 left, and DTO is here our book DTO. So I entered like 15. Hey, I want to book 15 seats. And then it says, okay, you have a conflict. We only have 5 left and you want to book 15. So that doesn't work. And that conflict is returning 409. And this scenario here, this is our domain rule validation. That would also appear in your local airport. If you go and buy a ticket, like 5 tickets for a flight, and that guy at the airport is telling you, hey, we only have 2 seats left, then it's exactly this. The flight has 2 left, you want to book 5 seats, and the conflict is that the person is telling you, we only have 2 seats left, so go ahead and wait for the next flight or whatever, right? So it appears to both sides. And this is why it's a business problem, a so-called domain validation rule. Now let's try that out. In the flight controller, here we are already, scroll a little bit up, open up the flights list. Now we can take the very first one, which is going from Los Angeles to Istanbul, American Airlines, right? And here you can see that we have a random value, which is defining how many seats are available. Let's remove it and let's set it to 2. So we have 2 seats remaining for that flight. Let's run our application and let's try to book that flight, Los Angeles, Istanbul, in 2 scenarios, so that we really try out if it's now working and that our domain rule validation is working fine. So here we are. Let's search for flights and we got that Los Angeles to Istanbul flight. So let's click on book. You got 2 remaining seats, right? So let's just book it and let's try to overbook it with 10. So we got 2 seats left and I tried to book 10 seats, so that should not work. Let me open the console. Let me switch to the network tab. We just open it up a little bit more. And now let's click on book. You can see, well, we got a flight 409 error right here. And the message is saying the number of requested seats exceeds the number of remaining seats. So our message that we just have entered. So this is working fine. Now let's go ahead and try to book 1 flight or 1 seat. So number of seats 1. Let's click book. That seems to be working, right? So let's switch back to home, search for the flight again. Here you can see 1 remaining seat. That's because we are now decreasing the book information from the flight. So if I book 1 seat, we will now decrease that seat from the remaining seats of the flight. Book again. Let's try again 2. It's not working. Let's try to do 1 again. Book. It's working fine. Let's switch to home, search again. 0 remaining seats. Let me try to book 1. I cannot. I get an error. The number of requested seats is exceeding. So you can see that this is now working fine. For sure we need to go ahead into the Angular side of Vue and again add some validation here. Maybe even remove it if we don't have a remaining seat left, right? So next up, we again take care about the front end side. But now we have secured or improved our RESTful API by adding a domain validation rule. Now that we throw our 409 error, which is conflict, we should go ahead to our Angular application and check for exactly this error and handle everything on the client side now. So go ahead into your client app folder, app, and then book flight component, and for sure go into the book flight component.ts. Now let's scroll a little bit down until you find the navigation to /search flight right here. Got that? And here we implement the 404 error, and we now do that with error status 409 for conflict, right? So if error status 409, we can go ahead and lock this. We don't have to redirect the user for sure. So let's console.log, say error is equals to error. There we go. Now we log it into the console. We can also go ahead and set an alert JSON.parse error object. There we go, .message. So we take that error here and parse it from JSON format and then take the message and alert it. Okay, now in the next video we will remove the flight ID from our flight entity because it's unnecessary. Let's take a look at this now. Now go into your project, open up the booking entity that we have right here, and we no longer need the flight ID. Because if you take a look here, let's select it, let's make a right click, find our references, you can see we're not using it at all anymore. This is because right now in our flight we directly have the list of the attached bookings. Previously we were only able to find a flight booking relationship by using the booking flight ID and check if we have a flight with that ID too, or in the other direction for sure. It's also working. So let's remove it since we're not using it at all and we for sure want to refactor it. So we can save it here and now some errors will for sure pop up. So let's move into our flight controller. Now scroll to the nearly very bottom for me. Here in the new booking, we can simply go ahead and remove the DTO flight ID. So why do we need to do it like this, or why can we do it like this? Because we already have the flight, so we don't need the ID. We got the flight, and inside of that flight, we have bookings. And to that booking list, we're gonna add a new booking, passenger email, number of seats, right? So since we already know the flight, because the flight still has an ID, we don't need the booking to have an ID. Let's take a look at the flight. Press F12. Here again, F12, or simply go ahead and open up the entity. You can see flight has a GUID ID. So, however, the flight still has an ID for sure, but the booking is already attached to the flight, so the booking no longer needs the reference to the flight. Controllers are responsible for handling the input over HTTP. Including domain logic in the controller makes the domain logic hard to read. Hard to read means hard to change, and that's expensive when it comes to maintenance. High costs are also unhappy users and happy competitors. So, in order to avoid complex phrases like the single responsibility principle, let's keep the change local. Let's go ahead and in the flight controller, go to the book action right here. Scroll a little bit down. Here you can see flight bookings add, right? So this is the logic I'm talking about. That's a little bit hard to read, or however, it shouldn't really be inside of the flight controller, because we can go ahead and let the entity itself handle this by creating a method for it, for example. We will see that in action. Open up the flight entity. Here we got it. We got the record here, right? So now let's go ahead under remaining number of seats. So inside of the record, we'll go ahead and create an internal void. Let's call it make booking. And for sure it takes a string, passenger email, and a byte for a number of seats. Now inside that, we will not take care about the logic right now. We simply go ahead and throw new not implemented exception. There we go. Let's start using that make booking right here. Let's switch to the flight controller again. And here, right before we check if we have enough seats left and all of this, we simply go ahead right before that and say flight.makeBooking. Now we pass in DTO passenger email and DTO.number of seats. This is the information about the booking, right? So first of all, we check, do we have a flight? If we don't have any flight found, so we have a, well, invalid GUID, then we're gonna simply return a not found error. And if we have a flight, we'll go ahead and make a booking. And now everything of the logical part from the domain side will now be inside that make booking instead of here. Right, so I'm talking about checking, hey, do we have enough seats? Let's add that book to a list and let's reduce the remaining number of seats. This does not have to be right inside of the controller, because controllers are mainly for simply handling HTTP requests, so we can swap over the completely logical part from the controller directly into the entity where it should really be placed. So let's cut out what we got here. And as I said, I'm talking about the check if we have enough seats, then the add of the booking to the list, and a subtraction of the remaining number of seats. So let's go ahead, right click and cut that out. So right now we only have here make booking, right? Save it, switch over to your internal void here and let's paste it in. If you don't know what internal means, internal is a keyword or it's a access modifier to actually say that this method right here can be used inside of the same assembly. Okay, so here now he's trying to reference a flight, but we are inside of a flight. So if we make a booking on that flight, he will try, or he should try to reference this flight record itself. So we can go ahead and create a variable, say flight equals to this, for example, right? We can also go ahead and for sure say this remaining number of seats, but that should make it a little bit more clear. Now, instead of using DTO number of seats, we for sure go ahead and use that number of seats from the parameter. So just remove that, or however, write it in lowercase number of seats. Same goes for DTO passenger email. So we can simply, as before, take those information directly from the parameter, from the make booking, passenger email, number of seats, right? We use both of them right here, and again DTO, just simply fix it, so change it from DTO to parameter. Now as you can see, we are not able to return a conflict here, which totally makes sense. So now for our remaining number of seats is smaller than number of seats, means we have that conflict of not having enough seats left. We're gonna create a completely new error just for that scenario. So inside of your domain folder, right click and add a new folder and call it errors. Inside of that error folder, add a new C# class and call it overbook error. Just wait a second until it's loaded. There we go. Overbook error. This is fine. Public class overbook error. It's inside of the flight domain errors namespace. And now switch back to our flight.cs, to our make booking method right here. And instead of returning a void, we now return an object, because overbook error is a class and we will create an instance from it, which makes it an object for sure. So this is why we now return an object. Instead of returning a conflict right here, we now return, can do it like this. I would just remove it so that you can see it better. Return a new overbook error. For sure, we will need to add a using directive. No problem. Hold the cursor above it, show potential fixes, using flight domain.errors. So if we don't have enough seats, we will return a new overbook error. Now, in the scenario of everything works fine, we're gonna add the booking, reduce the number of seats, and then return null. So if we return null here, we should add the option of that object here that gets returned being nullable. So object nullable, right? Add that question mark here. That makes it for sure nullable directly. Okay, now let's try to handle that error. And if you like, you can switch from internal to public. That's also no problem if you want to use that make booking method here from a different assembly. So you can for sure make it public. We can also leave it public right now. And now let's switch back again to our flight controller. And here, where we make that booking call, you can see that we get for sure that nullable object. So we could have a potential error object, right? So var error equals to make booking. Now, as I said, it's nullable. And we can go ahead and check for if error is overbook error. Overbook error. Add the namespace first of all. Show potential fixes, use namespace. And if it's an overbook error, we're gonna return conflict and pass in a new object. And again, we can set a message to whatever you like, not enough seats, for example. However, you can write down whatever you like for sure. Now, we can save it. Great. Now, let's start our application. Now again, I registered as a passenger already. Let me search for a flight here. Got 2 remaining seats. Let's see what happens if I enter 5 and click on book. You can see the error showing not enough seats, right? So now it's popping up as an alert. That's fine. And well, that not enough seats means that our new overbook error got thrown or actually got called, and that we then afterwards show that alert here. Awesome. Now let's try to book 1 flight or 1 seat, and that should be working fine. Awesome. Okay, now just to make that clear, we just did that to remove the logical part which is directly correlated to our flight, right? We removed that to bring it outside from the controller directly into the flight where all of the booking should really take place. So the flight controller should mostly only focus on handling the HTTP request and calling the correct methods, for example, on the entities itself, like we did here. Amazing. So I just want to tell you that in this complete course, we are really building up the application completely linear. So we're starting from scratch, writing the first controller, writing the first DTO, then creating the entity. Then we'll talk about persistent storage, like using entity framework, for example, and all of this. So later on, when you start a new application, you maybe want to go ahead and already skip a few of those steps. So your development will be way faster, because instead of creating just a DTO and implementing everything with it, you would go ahead and directly create an entity and a DTO, for example, directly along the way. The problem with all of this is that web development itself is more of a complex topic, and we for sure want to provide you the best learning experience. And this is why we sometimes have to explain something very easy to you, and that leads us to the position where we then afterwards have to refactor some elements, for example, copying things over to somewhere else. But we also always want to explain why we are doing that, because many developers out there are writing web applications which are really not optimized. So they throw all of the code inside of the controllers. They don't have a domain layer. They only have entities which they send instead of DTOs. And once you're done with that course, you can take a look at those applications and say, oh man, I know how to do it better. And that's perfect. You know, great, let me add a domain layer. We should not send entities all the time, right? Controllers should send DTOs. Or for example, now let's take all of that logical domain code from the flight controller, which is taking care about booking, for example. let's switch it directly to the entity and call it from the controller instead of including all of the algorithms directly inside of the controller. I know that you sometimes may think, oh, is it necessary to now copy that over, or why didn't we do that from the beginning? But we have a linear path, right? So we have decided to teach you everything step by step, come back, refactor, go to the next step, refactor later on, but always explain you why. And if you now take a second or a minute and just recap of all of the stuff that you have learned, we bet that you will notice that you really have learned a lot of new stuff and a lot of best practices. And this is because of our unique custom teaching style that we have developed for this application right here. Awesome. And that's it for this topic.